the summer of 1808, Western Europe lay under the heel of Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French Empire. Since his rise through the ranks of the French military, Napoleon had been crowned emperor in 1804, and had since demonstrated his brilliance as a ruler by transforming France's governance and expanding French power through his legendary victories over France's enemies. But cracks were beginning to appear in Napoleon's armour, as he had lost control of the seas surrounding Europe to the British in various defeats such as the Battle of Trafalgar. But losing maritime superiority to the British meant that the only means Napoleon now had of hurting his arch-rival was through a European trade embargo, which he then enacted in 1806, forbidding the countries of Europe under his influence to engage in commerce with Britain. However, one of the most important trading partners Britain had on the continent was Portugal, who continued to defy Napoleon's trade embargo, which then prompted him to send troops into Spain, who was a reluctant ally of the French, to essentially force them into dealing with Portugal. The country was then soon overwhelmed by the joint French and Spanish armies, which forced its royal family to flee to South America, and the country being divided between the French and the Spanish. But unrest had grown within the Spanish government and monarchy, as its close ties with France and the loss of its navy at Trafalgar had resulted in Spain being isolated from its colonies, which inevitably weakened its power. The heir to the Spanish throne, the future Ferdinand VII, was strongly opposed to his father Charles IV's alliance with France, and was also unhappy with his father for appointing Emmanuel de Godoy as Spain's Prime Minister, as he also saw him as pro-French. De Godoy was then deposed in an uprising in the spring of 1808, which resulted in Charles IV handing the Spanish throne to his son Ferdinand. Napoleon, who had by this time sent around 100,000 troops into Spain, then sought to negate any possibility of the country reneging on its alliance with him by inviting Charles IV and Ferdinand to a meeting, at which he forced them to give up their claim to the Spanish throne, and instead installed his brother Joseph Bonaparte as King of Spain. The country's ministers largely accepted Napoleon's brother as king, but the general population refused to do so, and widespread rioting then broke out throughout Iberia, resulting in thousands being shot by French troops, and the start of the now infamous and brutal guerrilla war against Napoleon's forces in the country. This further resulted in massive numbers of French troops being tied down in Spain, which greatly weakened Napoleon's ability to fight at full strength in other parts of the continent. The British then decided to come to the aid of the Portuguese, and then sent one of its brightest young generals, Arthur Wellesley, to aid their oldest ally. But upon his arrival in Portugal, Wellesley was given a letter stating that he was now not to command the British forces, and was instead to be subordinate to Sir Harry Burrard and to Sir Hugh Dalrymple. This essentially meant that he would lose his chance to prove himself capable of command, and Wellesley then took it upon himself to confront the French before the ageing generals arrived. However, Burrard did arrive offshore before Wellesley could take action, and refused Arthur's plan to attack the French forces in Portugal. But thankfully for Wellesley, the French commander in Portugal, Jean Junot, did take the initiative by then attacking the combined Anglo-Portuguese forces, which then forced Wellesley to react. This then resulted in the Allied army then engaging the French at the Battle of Vimeiro on the 21st of August 1808, in which they were victorious. Indeed, Wellesley had, in the lead-up to his deployment in Portugal, made a close study of French offensive tactics. These usually consisted of dense infantry columns, which marched towards an enemy and battered its way through, or forced an enemy to retreat out of sheer terror. This method had proved itself to be staggeringly effective throughout Europe, but Arthur thought it could be exploited. He planned to do this by the use of sheer firepower, and deducted that if the French advanced towards an enemy in narrow and dense formations, that long lines of well-disciplined British troops, firing 4 to 5 shots a minute, should be able, if they stood firm, to outshoot and therefore decimate the enemy. This, combined with Wellesley's strict discipline, ensured that his troops feared his wrath more than they did the enemy, and along with his meticulous planning and mastery of the use of terrain, brought him the success which would define his military career. The Battle of Vimeiro was the first example of this, as the British formed into line, simply mowed down the advancing French until they were in headlong retreat. Wellesley's new tactics had been vindicated, but his jubilation wasn't to last, as he then argued with his superiors to continue the offensive, but Burrard and Dalrymple sought to negotiate a truce with the French, resulting in the defeated Junot being allowed to withdraw from Portugal without another shot being fired. This caused outrage back home in Britain, resulting in Burrard, Dalrymple and Wellesley being recalled, and they were then forced to justify the treaty with the French in a court of inquiry. All three were subsequently cleared, but a stain had been placed on their character which would be difficult to remove. Wellesley then sought to redeem his name by writing numerous letters to influential people in government and the military, which thankfully for Arthur resulted in him being allowed to return to Portugal, and this time being placed in sole command of British forces. After his arrival in Lisbon in April of 1809, Wellesley quickly moved to retake the city of Porto from Marshal Soult, who had occupied it, resulting in the Second Battle of Porto, in which the French were forced to retreat from Portugal. Wellesley then advanced into Spain and joined forces with the veteran Spanish general Gregorio de la Cuesta, resulting in them together meeting and engaging a French army under the command of Jean-Baptiste Jourdan at the Battle of Talavera in July of 1809. The Allies were victorious in the Battle of Talavera, but in the process lost nearly 7,000 troops, and with considerable French reinforcements close by, along with his supply lines being stretched to the limit, Wellesley had to withdraw back into Portugal in order to rebuild his strength. For over a year, Wellesley, now Viscount Wellington, waited in Portugal, as he received increasing intelligence that the French were preparing a large-scale invasion, which he prepared to counter by strengthening the defences around the city of Lisbon, which became known as the Lines of Torres Vedras. These were comprised of concentric layers of defensive fortifications, manned by local militia or armed citizens and Royal Marines, whilst the main British army was left free to engage the French where and when they attacked. This meant that when the invasion did finally come in 1810, the French under Marshal André Massena, who was one of Napoleon's right-hand men, was then forced into a state of inertia as the lines of Torres Vedras were too formidable to invest. His problems were then further compounded by Wellington's scorched earth policy, which meant that the foraging French troops had nothing to feed themselves with, resulting in widespread starvation in the French army, prompting Massena to withdraw from Portugal, and in the process he left the bodies of tens of thousands of troops behind him. Wellington then took the offensive in 1812, securing at considerable cost several forts on the Portuguese-Spanish border, one being Badajoz, the taking of which resulted in the loss of nearly 5,000 Allied troops. Wellington then advanced into Spain itself, and occupied the city of Salamanca in July of 1812, just as a large French army under the command of Auguste de Marmont approached his position. The two armies then faced off against each other across a wide plain, neither commander being willing to commit to the attack until an opportunity for an advantage presented itself. Wellington then noticed that a portion of the French army had lost its formation and become elongated whilst marching. He immediately then ordered an attack, which the enemy were unable to form a solid defence against, ultimately resulting in the French being forced to retreat. After Salamanca, the French were steadily pushed back until Madrid itself was liberated, and Napoleon's armies eventually retreated out of Spain until in 1813 Allied forces entered France itself. This reversal, along with Napoleon's defeats in his invasion of Russia, and his subsequent defeats to Allied armies in Central Europe, such as the Battle of Leipzig, meant that the writing was now on the wall for the French. In little over a year, the French had lost nearly 750,000 men on all fronts, which ultimately resulted in Napoleon being forced to abdicate the French throne, and being sent into exile on the Mediterranean island of Elba in 1814. Although it is certainly true that the French Emperor's main defeats had been in Central Europe and Russia, his army's losses in Spain certainly played a considerable role in weakening his forces, and the person who, more than anyone, had been responsible for the Allied victory in Spain was Wellington. On his return to London, Wellesley was awarded with the title Duke of Wellington and was then sent to Vienna as the British delegate at a conference to decide the restoration of peace in Europe. But whilst at the conference, word reached the Allies that Napoleon had escaped the Isle of Elba, landed in France, and was amassing troops to his banner. Once again the Emperor would have to be defeated, and Wellington was seen by the coalition powers as just the man to do it. Napoleon concluded that he had no chance of defeating the massive coalition armies in a prolonged war, and resorted to attempt to defeat them one by first attacking the armies of Prussia and Britain, which were situated in the lowlands of Belgium. He had amassed an army of nearly 130,000 men, but the combined armies of Prussia and Britain would outnumber him by nearly 2 to 1, so he resolved to prevent them from joining forces and defeat each one in turn. Napoleon's army then crossed the River Sambre south of Brussels on the 15th of June 1815, and he then sent a contingent of his army, under Marshal Ney, to secure the crossroad of Quatre Bras, which was only lightly defended by a single brigade of Dutch infantry, commanded by the Prince of Orange. Wellington, who was attending the Duchess of Richmond's ball in Brussels in the early hours of the 16th of June, was taken aback by the rapid French advance, and immediately rushed south to reinforce the Prince of Orange. Ney's forces had taken the crossroads at Quatre Bras by the time of the British Army's arrival, and were pushed back in turn by Wellington's forces. However, to the east, Napoleon had attacked the Prussian army under Marshal Blucher, and forced them to withdraw in the Battle of Ligny. The Emperor then sent a third of his army under Marshal Grouchy to pursue the Prussians, and then joined up with Marshal Ney to attack the Anglo-Dutch forces under Wellington. The Duke had had time to get to know the terrain around Brussels, and decided to make a stand against Napoleon's forces in the small village of Waterloo, south of the modern Belgium capital. Wellington had received an assurance from Blucher that the Prussian army would regroup and come to his aid, which prompted him to stand and fight against Napoleon despite being slightly outnumbered. The Duke then drew up his forces in a defensive position on a gentle slope, with 3 farmhouses anchoring his left, right and centre. This meant that Napoleon would have to take the farmhouses before he could bring his full weight to bear against the main Allied army. Wellington's strategy was simply to play for time, as he could only hope to defeat Napoleon's army conclusively with Blucher's support. This was then made more likely by the French being forced to delay their attack, as the previous night had seen heavy rain, which had turned the ground in front of Wellington's position into a quagmire. The attack then began on 11 AM on the 18th of June 1815, with Napoleon assaulting the Allied right flank around the farm of Hougoumont, intending to force Wellington to send reserves into it, so he could then attack the Allied centre. But Hougoumont held out for the entire day, which forced Napoleon to resort to attacking Wellington's centre despite it being at full strength. He then attempted to soften up the Allied centre with cannon fire, and then ordered an infantry advance, which was then met by Wellington's usual tactic of rapid-firing lines, which mowed down the French columns. The Duke then ordered a cavalry charge by his Scots Greys, which trampled the now fleeing French infantry, but the British heavy cavalry advanced too close to the French lines, and were countercharged by Napoleon's lancers, who cut the British cavalry to pieces. Then, at around 1600 hours, Marshal Ney thought he saw the Allied forces beginning to retreat, and ordered a mass cavalry charge to chase them down. But the French marshal was mistaken, as by the time his cavalry rode over the ridge upon which Wellington's army was positioned, they were confronted with dozens of infantry squares, which was the standard infantry formation to counter horsemen. The French cavalry were then forced to weave in and out of the Allied squares, and were themselves shot down as they were unable to penetrate the enemy's infantry formations. By this time the Prussians were on the outskirts of the battlefield, which forced Napoleon to divert troops to counter them and weaken his centre. Despite this, the farm in the centre of the battlefield, La Haye-Sainte, was now taken, which acted as an anchor from which Napoleon could pound the Allies with his artillery. The Emperor was by this time growing increasingly desperate, and was then forced to send in his final reserves, being the elite and fearsome Imperial Guard, which advanced towards Wellington's centre. This was the moment of truth for Wellington, as Napoleon had sent his best troops in column against him. But if any general in Europe knew how to deal with French columns, it was Wellington. He then ordered his men to stand, form line and fire, which after several volleys forced the Imperial Guard to retreat. Wellington then ordered a general advance, and along with Blucher's Prussians, forced the French from the field of Waterloo, ending any hopes Napoleon had of regaining power in France. Wellington's victory at Waterloo made him a hero throughout the continent, and the sovereigns of Europe then lavished him with gifts and titles as a mark of their gratitude. He had achieved everything he could ever have dreamt of in military circles, and could have easily retired safe in the knowledge that his name would have echoed down the centuries. But Arthur Wellesley evidently had a great sense of duty, as he then fell back on the profession that he had undertaken earlier in his life, that being politics. The British political landscape was by this time increasingly becoming dominated by the ever-growing clamour for political reform by the lower classes, which steadily grew and grew to near boiling point by the 1820s. During the previous 100 years, Britain had become the world's first industrialised country, and huge cities had sprung up in the Midlands and northern England, where the majority of the country's coal reserves were situated, which in turn were used as fuel for the steam-powered mills around which massive housing developments such as Manchester then arose. But the conditions the British people had to live under in these new industrial cities were hellish, far worse than the farms that many of them had moved off in favour of a new urban life. Then, in 1819, at St Peter's Fields in Manchester, cavalry were used to charge a group of thousands of protesters who were rallying in support of civil reform. Wellington, being an old general who had clamped down on unrest in his armies with the harshest of punishments, supported the suppression of the so-called Peterloo Massacre, as he was an ardent Tory who along with his peers resisted any reforms to the established order, as they greatly feared a repeat of the French Revolution in Britain. The Duke then served as a cabinet minister for over a decade, and along with other titles was made Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in 1827. But a year later, after the fall of the Whig Party coalition in Parliament, Wellington was summoned by King George IV, who asked him to form a government. The Duke of Wellington was now Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he then set about his new office with the same eye to detail and discipline that he had brought to his military career. One of his more successful decisions as Prime Minister was the passing of the Roman Catholic Relief Act of 1829, which gave full civil rights to Catholics living in Britain and Ireland. Wellington later stated that the passing of the Act was an achievement on a par with his victory at Waterloo, as he had to convince the King, the House of Lords, the House of Commons, the Church of England and the population at large of its merits. But being an old soldier to the last, the Duke often failed to grasp, at least at first, one of the most important aspects of politics, that being the ability to negotiate. This resulted in him refusing to listen to the now widespread clamour for political reform, which did nothing but fuel public anger against him, until by 1830 there were widespread riots throughout the country, and the King and his ministers, including Wellington, were receiving death threats. This then culminated in the sections of the Tory party who had been opposed to the Catholic Relief Act mounting a vote of no confidence in him, and Wellington then handed his resignation to the King in November of 1830, which the British monarch accepted. George IV then invited Lord Grey, leader of the Whig Party, to form a government, which then passed the Great Reform Act, which in turn increased the voting rights of the population. Wellington did not take part in the initial debates, as his long-suffering wife Kitty had died that year, and after he had tried to block the Whig reforms as Tory leader of the House of Lords, he was forced to back down and let the various reform bills through Parliament. This refusal to allow reform had made him a hated figure throughout the country, and he was then widely insulted and mocked in the press, despite his past deeds. He then remained in politics, but whenever possible from this point on, placed the good of the country above his own opinions, and sought to avoid any possibility of unrest by negotiating. He then gradually became less and less involved in mainstream politics, But the king did offer him the post of Prime Minister once again after the fall of the Whig government in 1834, but Wellington refused, suggesting that Lord Peel, the Tory leader of the House of Commons, would be better suited for the role. Wellington gradually then retired from public life and spent more and more time at one of his estates at Walmer Castle on the coast of Kent. He did find the time to sit for the odd portrait, and this amazing image is an actual early photo of the Duke of Wellington in his early 70s. Then, on the morning of the 14th of September 1852, the Duke, who had been asleep as usual in his old campaign bed, which he had used throughout his military career, said that he felt unwell. He was then seated in a chair, but lost consciousness and shortly afterwards passed away. Despite him asking for a simple burial, the outpouring of grief at the Duke's death was so great that he was given a state funeral in which his coffin was hauled through the streets on a custom-built 20-ton funeral carriage in front of tens of thousands of mourning people, until finally he was laid to rest in the crypt of St Paul's Cathedral next to Lord Nelson. The claim is often made that the Duke of Wellington was in some ways lucky to have won the Battle of Waterloo, as without Prussian help the French would have been victorious. This is true to a certain degree, as it is highly likely that the French would have won without Prussian aid, but it should be remembered that Wellington fought the Battle of Waterloo because he correctly predicted that his army would be able to hold the French for long enough so that the Prussians could come into play. Indeed, Wellington is often dismissed as being merely a defensive or unimaginative general, but I feel these claims are often born out of ignorance of his career, as a study of his battles and victories clearly shows that he was as good on the offensive as he was on the defensive. Although the Duke is often thought of as a kind of second-tier general, under the likes of Caesar or indeed Napoleon, when one looks at how competent he was in terms of his eye for detail, the training and discipline of his men, and his use of the terrain, not to mention his strategic and tactical skills, Arthur Wellesley is certainly one of the greatest British commanders of all time, and possibly one of the greatest commanders of all time, full stop. Whatever your opinion of the Duke of Wellington, the fact remains that there are very few people alive today on planet Earth who haven't heard of the name of Wellington, and do not also know that he was the man who finally defeated one of the greatest commanders of all time at the Battle of Waterloo.